So for my painting, I've decided to do The Birth of Venus, which was painted by Sandro Botticelli in Florence, Italy at the end of the 1480s, which puts this painting right towards the end of the early Renaissance and really right before we move into the High Renaissance. And this painting was commissioned by the Medici family, one of the most famous and most prominent families from the Renaissance. Um, since it was being painted in Florence, Italy, that put this in the Northern Renaissance also. I chose this painting for a lot of reasons. The first and foremost is I have a deep love and respect for mythology itself. I've always been really fascinated with Greek and Roman mythologies. I just think it's so different and unique from anything that's really kind of worshipped or studied today. So it's just a very stark contrast to what we know today. So I've always found things that very interesting. And I was familiar with the story of how the birth of Aphrodite, which is the Greek equivalent of Venus, and upon researching this, I found that it is also pretty similar. And it just kind of helps play into that symbolism. This photo is loaded with it, and I think it's really important. So as you can see, she's standing on a shell, and she's floating on the sea, and that's because the birth of Venus comes from when Kronos castrated Venus's father, Uranus, and cast his genitalia into the ocean. From the sea foam is when Venus was born. So her birth is symbolizing the overcoming of brutality and negativity, hurt, just war, everything really negative, and from that, love prevails. And I think that is a really unique and optimistic output. You know, people, when they think of Aphrodite or Venus, they tend to think of the goddess of love and lust and sex, and think of her kind of shallow and two-dimensional. That's the way she's typically depicted today, is when we think about her as being a more two-dimensional goddess. However, the root and symbolism of her is the innocence of love, and not just physical love and attraction, but also intellectual love. The lore of mythology, another thing that I've always found really interesting, that the Renaissance being in an era that was so predominantly religious, this is one of the first non-religious paintings we see of that time, in a stark contrast to what Botticelli was doing previous. Botticelli had returned from Rome to Florence, and he was in Rome painting 3 paintings, murals, on the walls of the Sistine Chapel. Again, everything in the Sistine Chapel holds deep religious significance. And for him to return, and this is the first work he works on after returning from working on something so religious. So for him to switch tones is something that I find really fascinating, is that it's a complete stark contrast to what's typically being portrayed. On the note of religion, although this is a non-religious piece, it reminds me of one of the most, if not the most, famous religious painting, and that is the Creation of Adam. And the main similarity I see between those two paintings is that it's in the face of Venus and Adam. So in the Creation of Adam, we know that he is being brought to life by God, and God has yet to animate him, or people speculate that he has just begun his birth. So again, we see that new bringing of life. And so he kind of has like this void, vacant expression on his face. His body's kind of slack, there's no tension. It's a very relaxed, again, devoid of any kind of emotion on the face. And if you look carefully at Venus, in her face you see that same kind of vacancy, no strong sense of emotion, and her body is overall just kind of slack. Her hands are gently laid to rest across her body. There's no real tension, and she seems to just barely be stepping off the shell or floating off of the shell, however you see it. And so in that, this is her birth. She has just been brought to life. And so there's a lot to take in, or maybe she hasn't come to her senses. But to me, when I look at the birth of Venus and the creation of Adam, their face and their body language is very similar in the newness of life. And since this painting was painted 27 years before Michelangelo paints the Sistine Chapel before the creation of Adam is painted, it's very interesting to think, is this where Michelangelo drew his inspiration? Was he inspired by Botticelli's Birth of Venus and his ideal of the newness of life and being brought into this world, that he drew inspiration from that? Because if you look at the creation of Adam, we also see mythology references where you see God is painted to how either Zeus or Jupiter, the equivalent in Roman mythology, was depicted in the ancient times. So we kind of see that mythology influence in God himself in the creation of Adam, and we see that similarity of the faces and the way they are brought to life. And so it makes me think that Michelangelo was influenced by Botticelli's Birth of Venus. So overall, I like this painting for copious reasons, and aside from the deep symbolism and the layers of color and technique and overall beauty of the painting, there's a really rich and interesting history with the mythology, and the depiction of this is a very new thing, especially for the era that it was painted in. So many things about this painting are really fantastic, and I really look forward to what you guys have to say, and I look forward to seeing your other presentations as well.